Good evening. Tonight we're doing a virtual First Friday because of the coronavirus. We can't have our typical First Friday, so I'm going to take the time to actually explain how to taste whiskey. I never get the chance to do that when I do regular First Fridays because it's always so crowded and people are in a hurry to get to the tables, and so tonight we're actually going to taste whiskey. Before we get there, I just want to show a few of the factors that can result in all these different whiskeys. So here are, the first step is the different grains, and tonight we're going to taste corn, we're going to taste rye, we're going to taste barley, malted and unmalted barley, and actually there's a few other grains that will be in there in some of the whiskeys. So the next step of significance is the malting, and particularly with the red breast, we will be tasting the difference between malted and unmalted barley. That's just soaking the grain and tricking the grain into thinking it's spring, so it converts the sugars, the starches into sugars, so that it could be fermented. Then next step is grinding the grain. Mashing is very important because you have a hot tub of water and you add the different grains, and then as the temperature changes you're adding different grains, and once you get it down to a temperature where the yeast can survive, you pitch the yeast into that warm now beverage and you ferment for 3 to 5 days, and once you convert all of the sugars into alcohol with yeast, you put it into the still and you do 2 runs. The first run is called the stripping run, where you strip the alcohol out of it. The second run is the spirits run, and that's where you collect the heads, the hearts, and the tails. And so that's what makes that wonderful taste, distinction, and the skill of the distiller is really magnified based on how he perceives and catches the hearts. And then some guys age. Tonight we're going to be tasting unaged as well as aged whiskeys. And so it would be aged in a barrel. I've included 1 blend, and we'll talk about blends when we get to that, and then it's bottled for consumption. So those are all the steps in making whiskey. So you can see how there may be there's thousands of different whiskeys and thousands of different taste profiles. So let's get started. The first one that we're going to have tonight, so I got your glasses set out there, so we're going to need 2 glasses. You got water on the table, and so there's a little bit of the corn, and here's a little bit, and that's all corn, and this is all rye. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of all corn and all rye. Now you're going to need a little bit of water in these because the corn is bottled at 50 or it's 100 proof, and the rye is bottled at 45. That's rye. This is the rye. Oh, I got something. There's your rye. Okay. All right. So what I'm using Lion Distillery corn, and I'm using White Tiger rye because it's 100% rye. Thistlefin had a rye too, but they had wheat in theirs, and that kind of takes away from some of the pepper. And so what I want you to do is, when we evaluate a whiskey, we usually evaluate the whiskey on the color, on the smell, on the palate, and on the finish. So pick up the corn and smell that, and I'm going to join you. And so this is made in Maryland, and Lion Distillery. This was done a couple years ago. This whiskey is bottled at 100 proof, and so you can smell the corn in this. And my goal was to have you compare this to the rye. So now in tasting, what you want to do is, you don't want to, Jack Daniels, you just pour it down your gullet. Here we want to leave it in your mouth a little bit. One little trick you can do about tasting is, if you leave a little pool up front, you can kind of dip your tongue in that little pool, and the front of your tongue picks up the sweet. Okay? So this first one, obviously there's no color, right? So there's nothing to evaluate with color. So let's go to the next whiskey, which is rye. So you guys already have that one poured. And so this should be a really interesting contrast because now we have 100% rye. And so what you get from this is from White Tiger. They're also in Maryland. And so when you smell it, you smell a totally different smell. You don't get that kind of corn sweetness. One tip that you can do on smelling is if you tilt your glass sideways like that and you put your nose down in there.
Open your mouth.
What's that?
And open your mouth.
And open your mouth a little bit. Yes.
Ah, it smells good.
Totally different taste profile. There is, the sweetness, there's not a lot of sweetness there. It's more peppery. It's more spicy. There is some sweet though. And Itsara is the distiller down at White Tiger. He uses a totally different yeast than most American distillers. So this might be slightly different than the typical rye that you would taste. Now, the next one, so make sure you sip that corn whiskey off to the side and keep the rye. Because now we're going to go to a whiskey that's been aged a little bit, and you're going to be able to pick up some of the benefits of a barrel. So this is Dad's Hat. Dad's Hat is almost all rye, so our comparison is rye to rye. But the Dad's Hat has spent at least or about 9 months. So this is 80% malted, or I'm sorry, yes, malted rye, and then 15% unmalted. And there's a little bit of barley in this because barley provides the enzymes in order to give the, in order to help the yeast start to saccharify. So now, what you're tasting, and what I want you to do is go back and forth from smelling the White Tiger to the Dad's Hat, and
Completely different.
completely different. Now we got barrel effects. So when you smell this, well, first of all, one of the first things that we look at is the color. Now this is hard in this light, in a dim distillery here. But you see the amber, and it's also kind of reddish. This is a new oak barrel. These aren't used barrels. Bourbon uses the barrels. The Scotches, they use second use barrels. But this is a new use. So you're going to get a lot of wood in this. So what spending time in a barrel does is that whiskey is going in and out of the wood. There's chemical reactions occurring. And now, when you go back and forth between that white whiskey and this, you will taste a mellower taste. You get a little bit of sweetness at the end with Dad's Hat because of that barrel. Maybe you'll pick up a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of caramel. Now, remember, we're leaving that little pool and putting our tongue in, and then when we swallow it, that's called the palate, and then the swallow is called the finish. And sometimes, you know, when that whiskey's been on your tongue and on the membranes of your cheeks, there's taste buds all throughout there. You can pick up that little bit of sweetness at the end, and that sweetness is coming from the wood. You taste that little bit of, at the end there's sort of like a little bit of vanilla, maybe a little bit of caramel that comes from a barrel. Dad's Hat has won several awards as the best rye whiskey. And now we're switching to Old Overholt. Now, the Dad's Hat will be an example of what was called a Monongahela rye. Very high mash bill, lots of rye. Out west, in the western part of Pennsylvania, out around Pittsburgh, in the Monongahela area, that was the style of whiskey. It was called Monongahela rye. And so here in the central part of PA and a little bit more to the eastern part of PA, the whiskey that we made actually was more of a Maryland style. Now it makes sense because the market for the whiskeys made here by the Eichelbergers was for the Maryland market. So Old Overholt is an old brand, and after Beam bought it, they changed the mash bill a little bit. This has corn. So now what you're going to be able to compare is that rye taste to now we're going to introduce some of the corn flavor. Now this is bottled in bond. It's 50%, so this is 100 proof alcohol. So this is going to need a little bit of water in it. And I want you to compare that to the Dad's Hat. And what you'll find is that corn adds a nice little bit of sweetness. And you can see why people were adding a little bit of corn.
It's better.
And why this whiskey was so popular. I love Dad's Hat, I love that rye, but I gotta say, I understand why the people in Baltimore like to mellow that whiskey out a little bit with a different grain with that corn. So save, George, save a little bit of your Old Overholt, okay?
And drink all the Dad's Hat?
Yeah, you can drink all the Dad's Hat. We're moving on now. But I want you to save a little Old Overholt because now we're going to go to a bourbon.
Seconded.
It's all good. Some's just better than others.
So what happened is, as the people that lived in Pennsylvania and Maryland kept pushing west for more and more land, mostly Scotch-Irish is my understanding. The Quakers, like George is portraying here, they stayed around here. They didn't really, they were happy to build a nice little town. The Scotch-Irish were looking for land because that's something that they couldn't get in. And the Scots-Irish, like Dill, they were living in Northern Ireland, so they got screwed by getting kicked out of Scotland. They moved them to Ireland, and people in Ireland didn't want them, so they sent them over here. And it was like, you can get land? It was like, yeah. And they said, well, what about the natives? And they said, you might lose your wife and a couple kids. And the Scotch-Irish are like, but I'm getting land? Yeah, you're getting land. It's like, dude, I can get another wife and I'll make more kids, you know. Land is what I want. So Dill came here in 1742 for land. That was the big thing to the Scotch-Irish. And the Germans, they had their nice little villages. They didn't really want to screw with the natives. The Scotch-Irish, they grew up fighting in the mountains with the British, with the, you know, the whole Catholic versus Presbyterian thing. So when they came here, it's like, we have to fight to get some land? No problem. Just get us the land. So York County is filled with all these people, the Scotch-Irish heritage that were looking for land. So this is the kind of whiskey that they were making here. So what's cool about this is sort of a blending of the cultures. So the Scotch-Irish brought their distilling skills. The Germans were they grew a lot of corn, they grew a lot of rye. And when the Scotch-Irish got here, they were mixing corn, they were mixing rye, number one, corn, and a little bit of barley. And this is very close to the kind of whiskey that was made here at Dill. So, find me a clean glass on your table. And next, we're going to have some bourbon. Now, so, a little bit of water, and take a sniff of this. And now, you're going to compare that to the Old Overholt. Here, this is majority corn. So this is majority corn, aged in new oak barrels, and this is going to have a really nice woody caramel, vanilla. So you looked at the color. The color is not going to show you a whole lot unless you start getting into second use port barrels, different things like that, where they're manipulating some of the flavors with barrels. So the colors are almost always going to be sort of an amber color. Might have a little bit of a reddish hue or a golden hue. This would be more golden because this is aged in a first use oak barrel. And so this should be a really, this is a bourbon. This is a classic taste of a bourbon. I didn't use the Maker's Mark. We also have some Maker's Mark here, but I didn't use that because it has wheat. and it even softens it up a little bit more. So that's why I wanted to use the old Granddad. So it's a nice whiskey. I used to just think that I would use the bourbon to make the cocktails like slings and toddies and stuff like that. But now I'm saving this old Granddad just because. What do you think?
I don't find it that much different.
Right.
It still has that little bit of peppery taste to
There
it.
is rye in it too.
Yeah.
So the bourbons always have a little bit of rye in there for flavoring. They got a little bit of barley, but it has to be at least 51% corn to be called a bourbon. Do you like it, Steve?
Very good.
All right. How about you, Sam? I know you.
It's okay.
It's all right. Sam's a rye guy. So now, what we're going to do is show you what barley is like. So this is 12-year-old Glenlivet, and the reason I chose this is it is the #1 sold Scotch in the world. It's a Speyside Scotch, and what I wanted to show you was just the classic taste of Scotch, and you're not going to get. I mean, you can buy more expensive Scotches, but this is Scotch 101 right here. This has
And
a
how long was this aged?
12 years.
So we went from not being aged at all, we're up to 12 years.
No. Well, yes, we went from not being aged at all, the first two, and then we had aged 9 months, and we went to aged 4 years, and then old Granddad is also, I think, is 4 years. It might be 2. I'm not 100%. I don't know what the bottle says. I think it says straight, so I think it's 2. By law, bourbon has to be 2, so I think it's 2. But this is 12. Now, Speyside is the northern part of Scotland.
Doesn't have a strong nose.
It doesn't have a strong nose, but the nose is different. The nose is floral. When you smell this, what you're getting is some of the effects of the heather in the water. Do you smell the floral now? If you get your nose down in there and tilt your glass up like this, and you get that floral smell.
Yes, heather in the water.
Heather in the water. The water, the peat and the water that it flows through, it has, the Scottish Highlands have a lot of heather. And you're going to get a lot of sweetness in this. You get sweetness from the barrel. You get sweetness from the grain.
So, very unique.
Now, Murray,
This is a wonderful whiskey.
is this a fresh barrel for this also?
No, this is a second use barrel. So
Second use.
Scotches, they buy the bourbon barrels because by law, bourbon has to only be they can only be used one time. So they sell their barrels to the Scotch industry, to the rum industry, and the Scotch then age that for 12 years in the Glenlivet. It's a Speyside, which is northern part of Scotland, and there's a famous spring there that feeds, and it's called it's called Jessie Wales instead of Josie Wales. The Jessie Wales Spring, and we were just talking about Josie Wales the other day. So,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful whiskey.
Excellent.
Missouri boat ride.
Now, from the Glenlivet, so what happened is, back in the day, all the Scottish distillers would make the whiskey from their distillery, but just like a wine, some years you would have better Scotch. You'd have, because there was better harvest of grain. The rain was perfect, everything was better. The distiller was doing a really good job, or maybe, he fell asleep at the wheel one year, and so they didn't have the consistency. So the next whiskey that we're going to have is a blend. And this is Johnny Walker Double Black. And the reason I chose this is, just like I used to be a bourbon snob, I sometimes was a blend snob. And I failed. Because this is
With
freaking awesome.
age, you grew wiser.
I grew wiser. That's a better way of describing it. So Johnny Walker was a grocer. He started buying all those single malts and blending them together. And the blender doesn't drink it, the blender smells it. So he's mixing together hundreds of whiskeys to get the exact flavor profile that he wants. So what they were trying to do with the double black is get smoke. So that's why I chose this, because a lot of scotches, people think of them as real smoky, and that's not the case. Did you taste smoke in Glenlivet?
No.
There was no smoke in that Glenlivet. But in this guy, you're gonna get some smoke.
Where does the smoke come from?
So the smoke comes from
A fire.
the malting. Yeah, the fire. Okay, smart ass. So smoke comes from fire. So the smoke comes from when they malt the grain, the barley. In this case, this is 100% barley. When they malt the grain, they stop it with heat, and so the Islay whiskeys are peaty. They use peat smoke. Here, there's not much peat. You don't smell peat as much as you smell smoke. Anybody, do you smell the smoke that I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, it freaking jumps out at you.
Now, Murray, is peat heavier than smoke?
I don't understand the question.
Well, the smell of peat would be a stronger scent than smoke.
We could have done a Lafroig or one of the whiskeys that uses a lot of peat, where so the peat gets into that grain as they're drying it.
They're burning the peat.
They throw it on a grid, and they wet it. And so what's happening is they're tricking the grain into thinking that spring is here. And so it starts to sprout, and when it gets a little sprout, a quarter of the length of the grain. I'm gonna put the camera on you. A quarter of the length of the grain, it's time to stop it. And so they start these fires and they pull the smoke filters and it dries that, it stops that malting process. Oh man, this is like sitting next to a campfire. They did a great job with this. The double black is a little bit more expensive than the black, but it's worth it.
It's not an overpowering smoke that's some.
Very subtle, just a hint that they wanted to give you. And it's a wonderful whiskey in order to let people taste what smoke in a whiskey tastes like. All right, we need a fresh glass. Now, 14 miles away from Scotland is the North Shore of Ireland. 14 miles away from the Scottish coastline is the North Shore of Ireland, and that's where the next whiskey comes from. This is Bushmills. So they've been making whiskey since 1608. Don't waste your money on just Bushmills. Spend $3 extra for Black Bush. Okay? Awesome whiskey. It's finished in sherry barrels. So, what you're going to get with this is a mix of barley whiskey and grain. The Irish can use grain, and it's unspecified. So it could be corn, it could be wheat, but they have a grain whiskey. But they finish this whiskey in these sherry barrels, and what you get is the sherry I think is really pronounced.
What is sherry exactly?
Sherry is a type of a wine. I think it's a fortified wine that's aged. Oh my God, the sweetness just pops right. A couple drops of water in that, and that sweetness it pops right out. You smell the sherry right away.
You can smell
Sherry's like kind of like Madeira or port.
it. That's good.
So now you got a whole, and one of the other things that you can look at is if you hold your glass up, you see the legs. It really shows up in this light. And that kind of gives you an idea of the viscosity. The next whiskey that we're going to have is really going to show that because it's a very viscous whiskey. So we're finishing up here tonight with Redbreast. And what is awesome about this whiskey is when the British said to all the British Isles, we're going to tax malted beverages. So the Irish said, you're taxing malted beverages? Like when we malt the barley, and the English are like, that's right. They're like, well, then we're not going to malt half of our barley. And that's why they came up with this idea of half malted, half unmalted. There actually aren't a whole lot of unmalted whiskeys anymore, but they're starting to make some. It was called winter soup because the mouthfeel of it was so different. It had a thick, viscous kind of flavor. So this Redbreast is half malted, half unmalted. Smell that. Fruity, young fruit, unripe apples.
Probably one of the mildest.
That's what I smell. Unripe apples. And then you leave that little pool. I should know what that's called, that area up there where that little thing is attached to your tongue. I don't. But you dip your tongue down, you taste the sweetness, and then when you swallow it, the finish, which is the fourth part, is
Very
honey.
pleasant. Very
It's
pleasant.
honey. This is the most expensive whiskey that we had here tonight. It's worth every penny. This whiskey, this can take you to happy places if you're stuck inside with the coronavirus. And so here from the Dill Tavern tonight, we raise our glass. Anybody need more Redbreast?
Huzzah!
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 Okay. I hope you guys had fun. I hope this makes it through the edit. Solange. Thank you very much.